Welcome, friends and neighbors. It is Professor Hamamoto on Sunday, August 18, year 2024, 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Welcome, one and all, to today's fantastic talk. The topic being Sir Robert Maxwell as Knights Templar frontman. That's quite a provocative opening, I would have to say. But hopefully, by the end of this talk today, I will have made my argument, at least sketched out the outlines, the contours of my evidence and my inferences that I'm drawing from the storied career of the media mogul by the name of, well, we know him as Robert Maxwell. He had about 4 names by the time he was in his early 20s. He's a man of many identities. And in fact, that is the flawed, I believe, thesis of the primary text that I referred to. This talk was, in other words, inspired by this particular book. It's called Fall: The Mysterious Life and Death of Robert Maxwell, Britain's Most Notorious Media Baron, by John Preston. And it was published back in 2021. It's still fairly new. But of course, I had done my reading on Robert Maxwell and, of course, Rupert Murdoch, going back to Peter Braystrop, the coverage of the Vietnam War, media and popular culture history and analysis, especially in the U.S. setting, is one of my academic specialties. So I'm quite familiar with the history of it. But my gosh, Maxwell and Murdoch, which we can talk about at some other point, but definitely Robert Maxwell represents the zenith, the endpoint of what modern corporate media has become. It's fused with the state, with the military, with intelligence. It's called corporatism. It's called fascism, in other words. And now it's becoming even more intensified because of the internet. And this is the last gasp. That is the capstone represented by Robert Maxwell. This was the last gasp of so-called legacy media, especially the print media, the newspapers. And this isn't in any books that I have read or any articles, but I suspect that part of the storyline that Maxwell was made to follow, he was not his own man. He was portrayed as a pull you up by your bootstraps, Horatio Alger type person, self-made man, everything that Americans in particular like to fantasize about. It doesn't work that way, as you know. But he represents the last gasp, and I think he was inserted to destroy what remained of the popular media, the people's media, for the people's voice, the vox populi, leading towards the completely hermetically controlled media that we're seeing today being imposed by not just the American people, but people all over the world. And you and me, all of us, we are struggling mightily against it from different fronts, from censorship to arrest to, of course, the ownership patterns where it's become an oligopoly controlled by the military / political economic elite centered in Brussels. I use the conflation UNATO. If you want a name for it, let's call it UNATO. One is the globalist diplomatic arm, and the NATO part is the military enforcement arm. And they're having a tough time of it right now because of you and me, because of citizen journalists, because of people who have stepped forward and have maintained the truth as best as they could. People like the author Gordon Thomas, who I knew slightly. I visited him at his home in Bath, England, several years ago, because I'm a fan of writers, and I consider myself one. I'm a published author many times over, and that's my fraternity, not the sports, not the rock stars, but writers. All right. And the reason why I'm mentioning Gordon Thomas today is because where I found this book lacking is precisely where Gordon Thomas, years before John Preston, years before, detailed what Robert Maxwell and his ilk, he's not the only one, but we're focusing on Maxwell here, what they represent and who they really work for, right? You can call them the New World Order, the oligopoly, whatever name you have attached to it. It's certainly not Donald Trump. It's not Kamala Harris. It's not Joe Biden, the usual suspects. And don't let all the electioneering hype get in the way of our rational faculties and our pursuit in trying to lay bare the underlying structures that bring forth these puppets. All right. And I've been reactivated on Twitter, now called X. And I have a presence there. I hope you'll follow me there. I'm at Professor Hamamoto at Dr. Serizawa. And for those of you who are Gojira fans, or Godzilla, as it was called in America, if you are Gojira fans, you know that Dr. Serizawa was the man with the eye patch, and he took down the oxygen destroyer to the bottom of Tokyo Bay to kill Gojira, who, by the way, was Gojira's father was the Americans who were dropping atomic bombs in the Pacific. That's where the premise of that movie came from. It created these abominations, these monsters from the deep sea, reawakened them to terrorize humanity. It's not one of those silly little pop culture artifacts. There's some deep politics behind it. So I turned to my friend and colleague, who is now deceased, Gordon Thomas, in order to fill out the story and remind us the importance of these underlying structures that are being conveniently occluded or overlooked or just shunted aside while we go through this election mania. Stop it. That's all I read on so-called X. That's its main function, is to get us all opining or chiming in on the headline of the moment. And if you're looking for quickie one-liners, don't watch the show. This is for people with analytical minds, not goldfish with zero attention who need to look at Stu Peters or Jack Posobiec or some of these one-line kings that we see on so-called alternative media. This is not for you. And if you want to see a more extended break, I talk about it all the time on this channel. But if you want to see a more extended, dedicated talk on that, see the Sarah Westall show, where I spent an hour with her talking about my favorite topic, the pop-up pundits. Right? That's not what we do here. And what we're attempting today is trying to understand the current events in Gaza, the war, right? I'm sure you've been paying at least minimal attention to realize that we're on the brink of all-out total war once more. The first major all-out war of the 21st century. The other ones are more localized, not to minimize them. And more recently, we had the assassination by Mossad of Israel of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. They had planted a bomb in his home, and they blew him up when they felt the time was right. So assassination as a means of political process is very much in play, as we saw in the near miss in Butler, Pennsylvania, not too long ago. And now, predictably, we're getting caught up in the forensics of it, right? Oh, what trajectory did the bullet come? Were there 2 or 3 shooters? Who was there? Who's this? And X, Y, and Z. It's going to lead nowhere. And there are any number of people out there who are leading these little rabbit chases, these rabbit hunts, right? And we like to follow that from moment to moment without understanding the underlying structure and what's at stake here. That's what I am attempting for those of you who are new to my methodology on the Professor Hamamoto channel that's been running for 3 years now and has still not hit 40,000 subscribers. For all the freeloaders who are watching right now, subscribe. And if you want to help me even further and have access to all kinds of extra material, like some of the material I don't have time to post here or share today, check out my Patreon. I have many, many happy followers on Patreon that get all kinds of interesting material that you're not going to get here for a number of reasons, right? It's TubeView after all. I can't put everything out there. I can't put everything out on Patreon, but I can put more out there that we're unable to go through here on this limited platform. So I was inspired by John Preston's book. It's inadequate. So I said, well, I'm going to reintroduce my own original insights, the Professor Hamamoto research. All right. Like I said, I'm not a newbie. I've been at this for years and years, and I have a particular research interest in, and that means I've published widely in it, in media, especially American media, popular media, electronic media, and what was once press, or we used to call it print media, all of that. And of course, the popular culture of film and television, primarily, right? And I was finding that my employer, the University of California, Davis, didn't want me to go there. And because they told me not to, I had to figure out the role of the university system in suppressing this knowledge. It's deep and extensive, and I've shared with that information with you in other places, and I'll continue to do so. So I had to call a premature end to my career by the end of 2017, and went into the belly of the beast. TubeView, here I am. Now I'm a YouTube celebrity with all of 39,000 subscriptions after 3 years of hard work. While the pop-up funded pundits, they're funded, by the way, by the same indie media that they pretend to despise. Do you understand that? You know the phrase full spectrum dominance. Well, it applies to the pop-up punditry. All right. I know it's amusing. You could listen to Joe Rogan for 3 hours straight on your couch, smoking a doobie, drinking some Red Bull and washing it down with some other energy drinks or alcohol, whatever it is, that makes you feel good. But you're going to get the deep understanding here today. Today's talk is no exception to that goal of mine. And so-called indie media has also boycotted me. Sarah Westall, who's an original gangster, kindly invited me onto her show, but most of them won't have me on. I have my suspicions why. But I've been on some of the big shows, John B. Wells, Alex Jones, and so forth. But the other people know that they can't hold a candle to Professor Hamamoto. They have a whole staff of writers that write their clever little one-liners, and they can't really speak to me one to one. Right. So they'll stick with the safe people, your Brett Wienerstein and your Jordan, Mr. Weepy Peterson, people like that, who have been appointed, who've been delegated that sort of role within the supposed defectors of the academic world. All right. But they can't go as deep as me because I have the research and first-person experiential background to break it down for you here on TubeView. Now, I've already alluded to Mr. Gordon Thomas, wonderful gentleman. By the way, he's told me himself he's related directly to the great poet, the Welsh poet, Dylan Thomas, who Bob Dylan took his name from. His real name is Robert Zimmerman, as you know. And Dylan Thomas famously drank himself to death in Greenwich Village. Anyway, they're related, just for point of fact. Here is what Gordon Thomas has to say about his book, which was a runaway bestseller in Britain. This was the first book, and this is really the first example that I saw that really gave me an indication what I was dealing with so far as the New World Order is concerned, and who are the main players. And Gordon Thomas, in case you don't know, is a respected journalist. He has contacts within all the major intelligence agencies, and he's lived to tell about it because they need him to disseminate information, just as he needs them for sources. So it's a complementary relationship. He didn't tell me that. That's what I figured out without even having to ask how it operates. So here's what he has to say about his book, which I think is still the classic, and you might be able to find it used.
This book is absolutely, it is riveting. It is, you can't put this book down because Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon bring to the pages of this book intricate details about the involvement of Robert Maxwell with the Israeli Mossad spy agency, and they show how it was the Mossad who put an end to Robert Maxwell's career. On the telephone with me right now from his home in Ireland is the co-author of this book, Gordon Thomas. Gordon, welcome back to American Freedom News.
Wonderful to be back again.
Oh, Gordon, I'll tell you, I can't put this book down. This is fascinating book. You've outdone yourself. What is this? Your 40th book? 45th?
Yeah, it's the 40th. Yep. Yep. She's running away in England. We've gone through 6 reprints in 4 weeks, and it's done about 27,000 copies in the States, which is pretty good in this climate. But I think the attraction is, is not, Chris, is not that it's just a story of Maxwell, but it is. It's one of the greatest thrillers I've ever encountered in my whole life, because many years ago I briefly worked for Maxwell as one of his reporters in his vast newspaper empire, and he was an absolute monster. And I remember, and this is the man who made off with hundreds of millions, by the way. I remember him coming down the editorial floor of the Daily Mirror and raging. He was holding up an expense sheet of some hapless reporter who he discovered had cheated him by all of 50 cents. And this reporter was fired on the spot. Now, what made it particularly poignant, of course, it was the day before Christmas Eve. You imagine, he says, "And a happy Christmas to you," and threw him out. He was extraordinary, Maxwell. He was bizarre.
Over 50 cents he fired a reporter.
And of course, as Gordon Thomas goes on, he stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his employees. He was looting their pension fund for the newspapers that he acquired and ran into the ground. So I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on the details of the career of Robert Maxwell. Most of you can find it out. I'm trying to determine what the meaning of his career was and what his function was and what his long-term effect on the media firmament is today in 2024. So I tend to disregard the personalities that are involved and disregard some of the quirks that he exhibited, such in his own private library. He had fake books up there. He's supposedly this big shot publisher who bought Springer-Verlag for pennies on the dollar right after the war, like in 1947. And Springer-Verlag, in case you don't know, is the premier science journal publisher for the last 150 years or so. It was already like 100 years old when he acquired it. I'm talking about Robert Maxwell. I think he was going by Robert Maxwell by that time. By the way, one of the arguments here is very weak, Preston, is that Robert Maxwell had an identity problem, right? He was born and raised as an Orthodox Jew in what is now modern Czechoslovakia, and he had all these different names and nationalities. He didn't even know English. He studied, supposedly, this sounds like, BS, but he studied the speeches of Winston Churchill, and that's how he adopted his plummy accent, his tough accent of a toffee nose, instead of some Czechoslovakian Jewish refugee immigrant. And he supposedly was fluent in 6, 7, 8 languages, right? And all the time, he was a double and triple intelligence asset. And he's the king publisher. All right. Are you already following me or anticipating where I'm going with this? You all know about Operation Mockingbird because Annie Jacobson has supposedly written the definitive book on it and wrapped it up in a neat bow. And she's told us all that we think we need to know about it. The only problem is that Mockingbird was very much alive and well when Maxwell was functioning, and it's alive and well in 2024, and it could, as it already did in 2020, steal another U.S. presidential election. So we're not just dealing with personalities and wowie zowie. We're fighting over the life of the republic here, the American Republic. And it was done by these foreigners, these foreign nationals who infiltrated the United States of America in all its key institutions from academia. They're all over in the university, by the way. They're all over. And they're not Chinese either. And of course, my favorite, the bête noire, the publishing field, the major publishing slots are filled by Brits, not Chacoms. And the whole anti-Chacom hysteria is being fomented by the mastermind fuckers of the world who have generations of intelligence background so they can screw one duke and one baron over the other and consolidate their kingdoms. And the final kingdom will be planet Earth. I'm not saying that the Chacoms are not a problem. Believe me, they have their own centuries-long intrigues there. But the frenzy that you hear being whipped up on indie media is a distraction from the real perpetrators that we're talking about here. And myself, as a yellow person, I am not going to be scapegoated once more. You tried to scapegoat me during the collapse of the American automobile industry in the 1980s, right? We talked about this, me and David Cranmer, Underdown, Detroit Dave. We talked about this last week. And you're not going to scapegoat me like you did in World War II, and you're not going to scapegoat yellow people today in 2024. All right, I'm just telling you that. Because if you're a student of history, you see these patterns recur. And we are what's called the indispensable enemy. And by the way, before it ends today, I'm going to show how Japan and East Asia also intersects with this larger takeover, globalist takeover by these media barons who are one of the tentacles for this larger intelligence corporate operation that has encircled the globe. And it didn't start recently. It started hundreds of years ago. And it started with the Dutch East Indies Company, later the British East Indies. So we're talking about the middle of the 16th century. All right, that's how far back it goes. And the reason I mention this because there is a Dutch connection here to the Murdoch or the Maxwell publishing empire. He was a front man, remember. Who were the people behind him? Who was the handler of the handlers? And who handled the handlers? I'm saying it's Knights Templar. Not me, not just myself alone, based on the reading that I've done, which I'll establish in a moment after having given you this extensive introduction. So that's Gordon Thomas. I don't even think that Gordon Thomas, not to his, that's just no knock on him, but I don't think he really understood the Knights Templar. Maybe he did, but he wasn't giving up that information to me. But the Templar background of British intelligence, James Bond, as I've told you already in a previous underappreciated talk by Professor Hamamoto, right? I did 2 talks on Ian Fleming and 007. And my conclusion, I haven't read this by any so-called scholar of James Bond or Ian Fleming, but James Bond, the fiction character, was a Templar knight, and he was Scottish. That's why when M said, "Hey, we're going to recommend you for a knighthood," he turned it down. This is the last volume. I read all 27 volumes back to back in chronological order as an exercise. Check out those talks there that have been shadow banned on my channel. They're still there, but they're suppressed. But he was a knight himself. And then another famous spy, you'd call him, was named Simon Templar. Remember the saint? It wasn't so popular in America, but in the US, definitely. He was called the saint, his real full name. So these are like obvious clues, right? And the reason why James Bond refused the knighthood is because he already was a knight. It would be a redundancy. And that's how the intelligence networks work. How do you think the original Knights Templar consolidated their global, for the time, empire, their banking empire, through intelligence, stealth, and advanced knowledge, and assassination where necessary, because they rubbed shoulders with the Ismailis, who I also gave a talk on. It's the Professor Hamamoto channel, gave a whole talk on the Ismailis, known otherwise as the Hashashins, who have married into British and American celebrity and royalty. So you check that out. So this man here, Jan Ludwig Heimann Benjamin Hoch, who later became known as Robert Maxwell, has all these multiple identities, which were perfect for the times, but he outlived his times. I'm talking about the immediate post-war period. And during the war, he was a certified war hero. He won the military cross, fair and square. And he used that in order to gain entree to certain aspects of the intelligence network to fund his empire. But he outlived his usefulness, especially when he started to put the pressure, as we'll see at the end of this cast here, put the pressure on the Mossad to loan him hundreds of $millions to bail him out of his incredibly devastatingly bad financial situation. He was in debt to hundreds of millions of dollars. Even as much looting as he did of his employees' pensions funds, he was still behind. At one point, the interest payments alone on his outstanding loans was something like $300 a month, a year rather. I'm sorry, not a month. 300 million. So before we go on, what was Springer-Verlag, which he bought in 1948 for, well, he didn't buy it outright, but he developed a relationship because all that material was embargoed, right? World War II ended in 1945. So the Springer people wanted to figure out how they're going to survive as a publishing concern. And by the way, skipping ahead to 2024, they are today the #1 science, nature, artificial intelligence, computing science, engineering, biomedical, AI publisher in the world in the English language. Springer-Verlag. And I don't have to tell you that there was a close collaboration between Springer and the Third Reich. And Axel Springer himself, he's one of the descendants of the original founders, did a self-study and said, yes, we were involved in Third Reich, and but we've exonerated ourselves, and they went on their merry way and laundered their reputation, and they're still a thriving concern now, except now they're in the digital domain, and they're more powerful than ever. That's why this talk of 2024 is just not of past historical interest. It's of today's political interest, because all the technologies that we're seeing being rolled out were first theorized and published in Springer-Verlag journals, academic journals. And they eventually trickled down. People like Peter Thiel's think tank and Jeff Bezos' people, his engineers, they read the journals and they sit around and tell the boss where the fields might be heading. And then they can buy up the patents and seal up the technologies and really command all the emerging areas of profitability and control is what they're after. For years and years they had. Springer-Verlag. There should be a book on them all alone. I'm not going to write it. There's too much to do. I'm just giving you some hints on where to look instead of just repeating the stuff that you're seeing on TubeView or that are echoed and mimicked by Joe Rogan or by the other comedian. What's his name? The British comedian who pretends he's an American and tell us how to think? Russell Brand. What right does he have to tell us to think about our own society, our culture, and our own politics? Zero. So I put him in the same category as Tina Brown or these people who now run Anna Wintour, who run Condé Nast. I put them in that background. I put him in the intelligence category. But most people don't know because he can get a laugh out of you. So let's take a quick look at Springer-Verlag. I'm not going to waste too much time just so you know how legit they are. You get the idea. They have a long and illustrious history. People like Albert Einstein and Max Born, they've all published here, and all the great people, scientists and minds who are angling for the future Nobel Prize, they want to be published in these prestigious science journals. And as I have revealed on previous talks, a large percentage of those articles are fake. The results are fake. There's too much publishing going on. There's too much self-dealing. I've spent a lot of time in other talks telling you about the details, right? Including the recent president of Stanford University. He was another foreign asset. French nationality, I believe, who was supposedly a top neuroscientist. He fabricated a lot of his experiments, and it took him to the presidency of Stanford University. So these are not just aberrations I'm talking about. This is baked in to the current system, and we worship at the shrine of science. She blinded me with science. Mrs. Sakamoto, yes, we blinded you with science. Thomas Dolby. And we are blinded by science. And at the same time, while we're blinded, we have these sneak thieves called Robert Maxwell looting our pensions. And if you think it's just the New York Daily News, you better check your pension fund. The same goes with me. I'm on Social Security, but that's no guarantee that I'm going to keep getting paid. I don't care what the campaign promises are. I got to watch the wolves of Wall Street.
Newspaper is shrinking big time. The Pulitzer Prize-winning paper announcing a 50% reduction in its editorial staff today. The Daily News was the first American paper printed in tabloid form, but it will now turn its attention to online reporting and breaking news. Eyewitness News reporter Tim Fleischer with reaction.
Daily News reporters and photographers, hugging and consoling each other, left the tabloid's newsroom for the last time.
They're going to be okay.
The editorial staff here taking a big hit in a major round of layoffs.
I feel very privileged to get to have gotten to work with some of the best in the business. I feel like I grew up at the Daily News. It's meant everything to me.
The Daily News was sold to Trunk Incorporated last year.
This was some years after Robert Maxwell. I get him confused sometimes. This is years after Robert Maxwell fell off his boat, which I'll get to in a moment, back in 1991. I think they sold the company for like $1, just a token. By the way, the person who wanted to buy the New York Daily News before Robert Maxwell was none other than Orange Man, Donald Trump, the same guy who gave a presidential pardon to another crooked publisher. It's almost like a redundancy, crooked publisher named Conrad Black. He's also up there. This is Orange Man. Maybe he's part of the scheme, right? You better think about that, right? I'm not telling you who to vote for or who not to vote for. I'm just saying beware, buyer beware. All right, let me move on then. You can read more about Maxwell's business dealings with all the newspapers. He wanted to be a media baron. He thought that's what was going to bring him power. Same with Donald Trump. He wanted to buy the New York Daily News, so that would be his platform for his political ambitions, right? Like I said, he died in 1991, and he committed suicide. Supposedly, Gordon Thomas said he was murdered. And this was shortly before he was exposed by people like Gordon Thomas as a spy for the Mossad, and also exposed as a spy for British intelligence. And he might have even worked for the Soviets. So he might have been double, triple spy. This was Robert Maxwell. And again, Preston says, well, it's because, he was Jewish and he was insecure about his identity and never admitted to being a Jew. And he had all these different surnames and adopted an Anglo-Saxon, he anglicized his name to Robert Maxwell to escape anti-Semitism. All this stuff that just really doesn't hold water. How about if he was just a cynical, opportunistic sneak thief on a grand scale? I can accept that. I mean, I don't accept it, but I can understand it. You don't have to bring in the whole psychoanalytic victimage end of it. And I think that's really what Preston was brought in for, number one. Secondly, Preston was brought in to dismiss at the very end of this book the argument by Gordon Thomas and his co-author that Maxwell was murdered and murdered by the Mossad. Preston, at the end of his book, Fall, dismisses the Thomas research, which was much more extensive than Preston ever achieved. He dismissed it as conspiracy theory. I think he used that exact phrase, that well-worn, outworn phrase. Okay, one thing that I did benefit from is little names that pop up on the periphery. Those are where you got to look at, right? Not the ones that these comedians talk about that are scripted out for them, right? What's his name? Greg Gutfeld. He's supposedly conservative, or Stephen Colbert, or these characters. They're all retooled comedians, right? Forget those names that they put out there and are designed to make you chuckle automatically. Look at the periphery. Right, just as sort of a methodological rule of thumb, look for the names that don't seem to matter, or they're just kind of skirted over. One such name, and I knew the name, but one such name that comes up early in this book by Murdoch, because he gave him the nut. He gave him the financial backing to get his foot into the financial shenanigans that later proved out to be intelligence operations, just like a lot of those CIA organizations that have a home in Silicon Valley or are listed on the Wall Street board. They're intelligence. Literally, they're not intelligence dominated, but they are born out of the intelligence milieu and made to look like corporations, companies. So this is a tried and true technique that we're seeing now. So this gentleman, his name was Charles Jocelyn Hambro, Sir Charles Jocelyn Hambro, 1897, died in 1963, right when the Beatles were hitting in America. He's a merchant banker, but he's an intelligence officer. It's not me saying this is a matter of record. He was also the head of SOE, Special Operations Executive, formed during World War II. Britain was already at war in 1940. That's when SOE was formed. But he also had a distinguished career in World War I, the Great War, as they called it. So he was, unlike most of these desk jockeys, he was in the field. He was in the trench. There's one thing you got to say from these OGs is they were out in battle. They were out parachuting behind enemy lines. They were getting shot. They were like tail gunners and getting shot down while they were bombing Japan. They later went to OSS, for example. Anyway, he was the head of espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance during much of World War II, and that's an extension. He didn't take any money for it because he was already a knight. Was he a Templar knight? That's for us to find out. The specifics, that's a pretty good assumption that he was in that Freemasonic orbit. He's a sir. He's a knight of the realm already, okay? So that should be a clue. Didn't take any money, but of course, he wanted to protect the franchise, which was his base of operations in Britain, because he ran the bank, Hambro's Bank. Let's take a look briefly at his profile. Sir Charles Jocelyn Hambro. You caught the name? Hambro's Bank. Okay. And what were the Knights Templars originally? And in addition to intelligence and warriors, yes, they were international bankers. Okay. And none of this, well, not none of it, but most of it has not made the history books in the university yet. They're still preaching some variant of Marxism or new Marxism or new left politics, progressivism. They're not looking at New World Order theory, which is really where it's at. Because all these other isms are offshoots that were funded by these same interests. They funded communism. They funded Marxism. They funded feminism. They funded every single seemingly liberatory movement you want to name. Because to fund it is to control it. And many of these clowns in the university and these so-called organizers and activists are stupid enough to feel that they autonomously are creating these social movements, not fully recognizing that they are controlled from inception through execution. So Charles Hambro. So let me get a little bit more before I run out of time about the Templar connection. And this comes from an article which I posted on my Patreon from Dean Henderson, who's written a couple of books on it. But he himself derives his insights from a previous book that most of you know. It's by John Coleman. It's a classic, The Committee of 300. So Henderson, after John Coleman, talks about the Royal Institute of International Affairs as being dominated by the Knights of St. John, Jerusalem, the Knights of Malta, the Knights Templar, and the 33-degree Scottish Rite Freemasons. And he talks about how the Knights of St. John was founded in the 11th century, and they report directly to these bloodlines. In this case, we're talking about the house of what is now a Windsor, but back then it would have been maybe Coburg or one of the Germanic strands, right? The legitimate lines are supposed to be Scottish, by the way. Right? There was that civil war and really kind of a still conflict that's raging today, sort of on a more muted fashion. And that bloodline goes to the Villiers dynasty. That bloodline intersects with the Matheson family, as in Jardine Matheson, the great Hong Kong opium traders, right? With Scottish connections, the Templar connection Jardine Matheson. Remember, we talked about that with David Cranmer Underdown last week. We talked about Thomas Glover, the Scottish Freemason who ran firearms and ships to the Japanese shogun and daimyo so they can fight it amongst themselves to eventually collapse Japanese political system so that the Scots could take it over, or the British. By the way, with the real popular series right now, Shogun is kind of an echo of this historical moment there, except for the first time they put an actual Japanese person in the catbird seat instead of Richard Chamberlain, because this is a remake of an original one. So maybe the people in Hulu are watching my channel and complaining, why do we always have to look at Asian history through the lens of the black samurai? Or he's got to be the white samurai, right? Tom Cruise, Keanu Reeves, and those people. No, they put Sanada Hiroyuki in the starring role because they know that finally the political axis has shifted. So when Hulu does, which is a streamer, when they can do it, then we know that there's a larger political cultural shift that's going on in America. I'm going to be doing a whole take on the Shogun series as soon as I watch it myself, because I'm familiar with a lot of the actors and talent that are involved in the movie that were recruited. So that's the Jardine Matheson connection. There's the opium people, amongst other commodities. And Colonel Edward Bulwer Lytton. He was a Rosicrucian. And Shakespeare, supposedly, according to Henderson, I'll have to check this out. This is news to me. But Shakespeare, of course, he predates Bulwer Lytton. He's a 19th century character. Shakespeare obliquely referred to the Rosicrucians, the Rosicruces. By the way, if you want to see a good talk on the Pasadena Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl game, Professor Hamamoto's been there and done that. He has a whole talk on the Rose Parade. It's about genetic selection of the rose bushes, which is what elites are involved with, in addition to genetic selection of the rose queens. And it's a Rosicrucian Bowl festivity. All right, that's the nutshell argument that I put out there that I don't think anybody's ever picked up on. You got to look at my backlist. You got to subscribe to my channel, and you've got to share this material out here, because I refuse to be sidelined in addition to being scapegoated. So anyway, Shakespeare referred to the Rosicrucians in his play as Rosencrantz, which makes sense. And the Freemasons, the dialectical opposite, supposedly, were Guildenstern. Gilde, as in money. Rosencrantz, or Rosenkreuz, the Rose Cross, right? Rosencrantz and the Guildenstern. Well, that Shakespeare or Edward de Vere, or whoever he really was, he really knew the internal esoteric history of the world. And the people who teach Shakespeare at the university are clueless about that for the most part. And instead bore us to tears in having us memorize these passages of Shakespeare. If you want to decode Shakespeare as these crypto texts, then you might have a really huge audience of Shakespeareans in the making. But no, they want to make it boring so that people won't probe it any deeper. Just like Hollywood wants to put out Mr. Miyagi or Hop Sing out there in TV and movie land, so that you will not really look past that and understand who are these people behind it and why are they being hidden. Is it to hide the Jardine Matheson connection, the Knights Templar attack? Is it an attempt to hide the Scottish Templar failed attempt to break open Japan? And to discuss the rise of the only Asian country that managed to escape European colonialism, which is Japan. and how they developed as a consequence, because they were not, until World War II, not brought into this globalist system. They developed on their own as a matter of choice and policy and politics, backed up by armaments and a martial tradition that goes back hundreds of years. So it goes on and on and on. Anyway, you might remember Edward Bulwer Lytton as the person who wrote the novel Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. And that supposedly influenced the Third Reich thinkers, the Vril Society. Remember the talk I gave on Maria Orsic, who talked about Vril energy? Right. So the occultic, the esoteric sciences intersects with the exoteric political economic system all the way down the line, and it pervades the literature, prose poems, theater, ballads, and now film, music, right? Check out my piece that I did on forgot the name, the recent film about intergenerational incest, starring Kate Blanchett. All right. So Bulwer Lytton is very much, or Lytton is very much part of this world, intersecting with people like Rudy the Kip, Rudyard Kipling, Lord Beaverbrook, and of course, Charles Hambro, as we saw, of the Hambro banking dynasty. They're all buddies. They're all part of this club that you're not a part of, and I'm not either. Okay, let me finish up then with the Dutch connection, which I alluded to earlier, right? Nagasaki, Deshima Island, was the only foreign nationality that was allowed in there were Dutch. Let me just very briefly, as a bonus for you, give you an idea of this little settlement in the Nagasaki prefecture. I've been there, where they isolated all the Dutch trade to this one port called Deshima. And that way they were containing the Jesuits, the Benedictines, all the different sects that were trying to convert the population and to take over the country and colonize it like they did to India and China and the Korean peninsula. So here's Deshima, Nagasaki. This is where my history intersects, because I know that the way most Americans are taught is that it's always something apart from Western history. But in the past 30 years, there's been something called world systems theory that says, no, we're going to look at it from a global perspective, a critical global perspective. These systems are already in existence as early as 500 years ago. Here we go, just very briefly. This is Japan. For the most part, it's a tourist area. There's even an amusement park, supposedly, and some sort of fantasy rendition of a 19th century, early 20th century Dutch village, which I didn't go to. They have their Japan, Tokyo, Disneyland, and all the other stuff, all these different recreations, just like we have our own recreations of different societies or different parts of American history romanticized. But that was a real port of exchange and trade and technology transfer, and of political intrigue, because that's where Thomas Glover settled. He married a Japanese woman, by the way. He had a Japanese family, and he had many mistresses as befitting his high station there. But that's where he settled as well. Okay, so let me return then and complete with the Dutch connection, and that is one of those incidental mentions of a name that rang a bell, just like Hambro. I said, "Yeah, I know Hambro. Let me check it out." How did he? Because Hambro gave the money to Maxwell to get him started in his corporate plunder career. Well, another person was a guy named Van den Heuvel, Vandn, Heuvel, Heuvel, Van den Heuvel, Dutch. And this is where you can assist in this project. Try to see if the Van den Heuvel that I'm going to talk about here is any blood relationship to the Van den Heuvel that helped front. He came out of British intelligence, helped front the money to subsidize Robert Maxwell's intelligence network and his newspapers. And this is what I get from the article by Dean Henderson and from Preston mention of his nickname was Fanny Van den Heuvel. His Christian name was Frederick. He was a count. He was a papal count. His father was a ambassador to the papal court of the Vatican, the Holy See, I guess. This is what I have to research. I tried a little bit in preparing for this talk. I didn't want to get too far deep into it, but this is something I'll be researching a little bit more thoroughly. Count Frederick van den Heuvel. And Preston here establishes the connection to Maxwell, but I was unable to see whether Van den Heuvel was connected. This Fanny Van den Heuvel was connected to the OSS, later CIA, asset William Van den Heuvel, who was an attorney. Most of you who do the research here on the CIA and the so-called crypto state and the OSS know the name of William Van den Heuvel. And I was interested to learn many years ago that he was the father of the publisher of The Nation magazine. Her name is Katrina Van den Heuvel. She's American. I just gave her the Dutch accent, or my approximation there. Katrina Van den Heuvel. Are they related by blood, Frederick Van den Heuvel? If they are, then the conspiracy deepens even further. The Nation magazine is published weekly. It's been in continuous publication since 1865. That's around the time of Abraham Lincoln. You understand? Abraham Lincoln, or Abraham Lincoln, if you prefer. Or they say down south, Abraham Lincoln. 1865, that's a long publication record. It's still in existence. I know. I was a subscriber to The Nation. It's a left progressive, liberal news weekly. It's probably online now. I don't subscribe to it anymore. I don't know what format it comes in, but every week in the mail, I would get My Nation. And I even submitted articles or reviews to it. And then I always get a little postcard pre-printed saying, sorry, we cannot use your submission at this time. And this is before I realized that we are not in a meritocracy, that no matter what work I did, I was not part of the Van den Heuvel Club. I was not part of their extended bloodline. Katrina Van den Heuvel is related by blood to Jeannie Stein, who was the mother or the daughter of Dr. Jules Stein of the Stein Institute and the head of MCA, the Music Corporation of America. He endowed the Eye Institute at UCLA. But you might know Dr. Jules Stein as the head of the mafia-run MCA out of Chicago. That's where Dr. Jules Stein came. He was an ophthalmologist by training, but he was one of the key characters in the Jewish mafia out of Chi-Town. And his lieutenant in Los Angeles was Lou Wasserman. Lou and Edie Wasserman, his wife, were known as Mr. and Mrs. Democratic Party in Los Angeles. They gave a lot of money to this is kind of where the Democrat / Hollywood connection was established. Because he said, okay, we're going to ease up on the censorship and we're not going to prosecute you for this and that. And, we're going to allow you to kind of live your lives, but you're going to have to kick some money over to us. That's Lou Wasserman. Check that out. So that's a Van den Heuvel as well. It goes on and on. So according to, moving on from, in fact, I'm going to skip this part here because I don't want to spend too much time on Van den Heuvel because it's tempting. He's an interesting character, and I want to see if he's related to Katrina van den Heuvel, who is she's what they call today is an influencer. She's a publisher. She's a person of letters. This is where the intellectuals go for their ideas, their talking points. This is where the big-time news editors read their op-ed sections. And this is where that tight network of writers work together to create the dominant ideology. And this is where they come together in the case of the nation to create this fake consensus around these synthetic characters like Barack Hussein Obama, Bill Clinton, Kamala Harris, or whoever you want to pick. That is the function of the nation. Again, the publishing connection. That's a Van den Heuvel bloodline. And again, I don't know if it's connected to Fanny van den Heuvel, but I suspect it goes back generations, back to the American Civil War. Why do you think Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the first place? Because they didn't like his beard? No, they didn't like his political economic policy and theory, and they wanted the republic for themselves, just like they wanted it back at Butler, Pennsylvania. These are warring factions amongst themselves that have nothing to do with you and me who are excited about all the different remarks that we read on X. Oh, yeah, Harris is so stupid. Oh, yeah, J.D. Vance wears eye makeup. Oh, yeah, blah, 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 woof, woof. You won't see me, I'm on X, but you're not going to see me engage in this type of repartee or fake repartee. It's just nothing but glorified he said, she said. And it's eating up your valuable creative time. Stop it. So let me move on to conclude with John Loftus. And according to John Loftus, and I'll show you his bona fides in a moment. According to John Loftus, quoting from him, recently a British historian obtained partial declassification of a key fact that Maxwell was recruited by SIS, Special Intelligence Service, to work for Count Frederick van den Heuvel, a leader of the pre-war and pro-fascist, right, private British corporate intelligence network called Z that paralleled the formal SIS structure and in many ways surpassed it. It was a commercial spy service run by and for the private property of the 1%. During the war, Fanny was appointed Swiss station chief for the British Secret Service in Bern, Switzerland, counterpart to Alan Dulles for the American OSS. See how it all comes together, ladies and gentlemen? Who is John Loftus, you're saying? Because his name has been forgotten and pushed out by the pop-up pundits. Pop-up pundits are killing history. They are killing the historical memory. Well, let's take a look on who John Loftus is. You're going to like it.
200,000 Americans lost their lives fighting the Nazis in World War II, and yet hundreds of those Nazis and their collaborators eventually wound up living comfortably here in the United States, becoming U.S. citizens. How did it happen? That is the story we shall tell in The Nazi Connection, a story you have never heard till now, of how highly placed U.S. officials, despite the express orders of 2 presidents of the United States, invited Nazi collaborators, killers, to these shores to trade what they knew about the Soviet Union for sanctuary here.
Several hundred Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe and Russia were smuggled into the United States for intelligence purposes.
Smuggled by whom?
State Department intelligence, specifically the Office of Policy Coordination. It was the first covert spy agency set up in the United States. It predated the CIA by several months.
Who is this man making these charges, and what gives him the right to say what he has just said? His name is John Loftus, and for 2 years he was a prosecutor with the Office of Special Investigations in the Department of Justice. responsible for weeding Nazis and Nazi collaborators out of the United States. His security clearance went 3 levels above top secret. But this young Irish Catholic attorney, now in private practice in Boston, has decided that his conscience demands that he bring to light what he says remained for too long, a dark and sinister top secret.
We had one unit of the government out trying to prosecute the Nazis, and other units of the government trying to secrete the information. We later established that the files pertaining to the Nazi immigration had been withheld from Congress, from the courts, from the CIA, and from the local agents of the Immigration Service.
Didn't President Roosevelt, didn't President Truman say specifically that war criminals were not to be?
Okay, Morley Safer is, or not, that's not Morley Safer. That's Chris, what's his name's father. God, I used to watch this shit 60 Minutes all the time. Wallace, Mike Wallace. Yeah, okay. He's asking a disingenuous question, but that's John Loftus. That was when the DOJ was okay, and he had clearance 3 times above top secret. Man, if that guy was on X would be worth something. Right now, it's just full of a bunch of commentators and ass clowns and retooled pop-up pundits and comedians who are wasting our time. So that's his bona fides. If you want to know the book, it's called The Secret War Against the Jews, How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, published way back in 1994. Now, this is old news to people here in the live stream, but it's because of the pioneering work of John Loftus, you understand? And that's not the end of pioneering work. I'm doing pioneering work in 2024, but I'm being ignored like Loftus was back then. But I have YouTube. He didn't have YouTube. He didn't have so-called social media. He didn't have X. But I'm being drowned out by the pop-up pundits, and I'm being shadow banned by TubeU. So this is my message in the bottle. And no, the police did not come up with that phrase. That's not Sting's song. This is just our own folk saying by the police, which also has CIA connections, as most of you know, through the Copeland Jr. and the third line right there. CIA. Okay, let me conclude then with the kicker about, again, bring it full circle to Gordon Thomas about, and I'll return after we see this to wrap the talk up, that Thomas comes up with his thesis, his argument, which is based on conversations with over 100 interviews, and also the original autopsy that was given to him by Betty Maxwell, the widow of Robert Maxwell, and all these documents that he drew from in order to come to his conclusions that Preston is attempting to whitewash in his more recent book. So you see how the historical rewriting process takes place, how it's done, it's being written over, just like the pop-up pundits are writing over history that they pretend that they discovered it. Candace Owens doesn't know anything. Everything that comes out of her mouth has been assimilated from YouTube. Do you understand? She's not a journalist. Gordon Thomas is a journalist. John Loftus is a journalist. And it's not just a matter of title, it's experience, it's mindset, its background, its sources, and its intentionality. And I'm just saying, I know the people in the live stream know this, but for the newbies who are trying to figure out what this madman is trying to communicate, this is really how the setup works. So let's finish up with Mr. Gordon Thomas, a great name in journalism.
And he starts to pressurize the one people who can't pressurize Mossad. And the result is they said he has to go. And the last part of the book is a textbook of how you put together the perfect assassination.
Well, basically, Mossad became afraid that a desperate, financially desperate Maxwell
Yep.
was going to double cross them, backstab them, and began to, with his media empire, he was
Correct.
going to begin to expose Mossad activities
Yep.
as extortion
Yep.
against Mossad to get the money. So Mossad said, "We got to put this guy out of business. We're going to have to, we need to bump this guy off." So tell us, we only have a few minutes here. Tell us about this top secret Israeli Mossad assassination team and this elaborate plan to kill Robert Maxwell.
Well, first of all, they spent weeks researching. They put together a team. It's called a Kidon unit. Kidon means bayonet, and it isn't a very appropriate team. It's the only assassination team in any intelligence agency in the world which works full-time only on killing people. And it's still in existence today, and it's killed dozens since Maxwell. But its job in this case was to carry out the perfect assassination and look like an accident. So they looked at a number of quick ideas they could do. First, could they toss him, break his elevator, and let him fall as he came out of his high-rise apartment? No, there's a risk that he might have other people in the elevator and kill them. Secondly, could they sabotage one of his aircraft? They could make it look like a crash, like perhaps John Tower died in a mysterious way, but then there'd be other people on the plane as well. They finally decided the only way to kill him was at sea, as if he drowned. And so they studied him physically, they studied him mentally, and they studied everything. And what they did, they put a 4-man team together, and they had a drug, a lethal nerve agent, which the team was to inject into his neck. First, they had to get him on deck alone. So they concocted a scheme. They said to him, all right, they called him up in London and said, look, okay, we said no to your money. Okay, tell you what we do. You come to the Canary Islands in the Atlantic on your boat, and we'll tell you what to do. So, and he said, do I get the money? He said, we'll tell you what to do. Relax. So he set sail from Gibraltar out to sea in the Atlantic, and he's moved here and there. And it's a wonderful example of how Mossad really do plan and plot. And they put an electronic net over the whole area so there could be they would know everything, signals coming from the boat to the boat. They'd know everything. There'd be no mystery for them. And then the 4-man team set off in their own boat, and they waited until they got their instructions. Maxwell was then told in what he thought was a call emanating from Tel Aviv. It wasn't. It was coming from one of the backup boats that the Mossad had in the area. And it told Maxwell to be on deck in the early hours of that morning, and that he was to wait there on the port side, and he was to make sure the deck was empty, and they would hand him his money order. And they said, now, you understand, Robert, when you've got this money, that's it. You don't come anymore. You just understand that, okay? And he was so good. He said, absolutely understood. Of course, 400 miles. Wow, terrific, no problem. Well, it went clockwork smooth because they'd rehearsed and rehearsed it. They came alongside, and you have to think of the boat. A boat is a very large boat. It's not a little rowing boat. All the crew were mostly on sleep watch. There was only a minimal crew on the bridge, and they were peering forward anyway. Where Maxwell was told to stand was right at the aft, and they came up on the opposite side of the boat. The boat was traveling. It's a big, powerful boat, and they were able to scramble on board because they, were trained for that. They came on board across the deck, jabbed him in the neck, lowered him into the water, still alive, and then they drowned him as if he'd fallen over the side.
Well, that's so far as I'm concerned, the definitive account by author, researcher Gordon Thomas. And I think I might have already posted that on my Patreon in case you wanted to look at it. I think you should listen to the whole interview. It's excellent. The interview is excellent as well. So that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us full circle here. And you understand, and maybe I didn't flesh it out quite thoroughly, but the connection between why British intelligence would work and cooperate with Mossad. Think of the Knights Templar history. Originally, what were they doing? They were ostensibly protecting pilgrims on their journey to Jerusalem. They had a presence there, right? And so they've been working with local people there, and now Mossad, for generations prior to modern times. In addition to that, a lot of the British nobility believe that they are the legatees, that they are the heirs to Israel. It's called British Israelism, that they are one of the tribes there that are the heirs to this illustrious history, and they're going to protect it at any cost, even if they have to burn one of their own assets. And they are assets, and all assets are expendable. And this is why, running up to election 2024, we probably are going to be seeing a lot of quote unquote accidents occur. But now you will have a structural understanding of where it's coming from and why it's being done. And you'll understand why listening to the retooled comedians, pop-up pundits, is an exercise in self-destruction. So on that happy note, I'll leave you here. I'm glad I managed to squeeze that all in 1 hour and 15, 17 minutes, something like that. If you have any questions or corrections, please post them in the comments. Check out my Patreon for further information and supplementary material. And no doubt I will continue to build out this whole this secret Templar history that's being played out in 2024. All right. Try it as an exercise. You don't have to believe this, but just as an exercise, try to wrap your mind around this notion that there is a war amongst these different forces that go back hundreds of years. It's not just about Republicans and Democrats. It's not just about red and blue states. Come on. Are you that childlike? Are you that juvenile to think that it's that simple? No. History is nuanced, and it was once hidden. But all that is hidden is now revealed, thanks to your attentiveness. So, ladies and gentlemen, please share this with your friends and neighbors and your children. Have them take these themes and these subjects back to school with them in the fall. And if they're majoring in history, sociology, women's studies, or in the sciences, they can do all kinds of research on this, and they'll be excited about it because this is the true nature of human civilization. This is the true history of it. We're still working on filling out the gaps in knowledge, but we're on the right path here. Historiographically, we're on the right trail. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week, God willing. Bye.